Chapter 9. The Soul Taker's Attack. Jen scrutinized Lawrence carefully. He gave off a level of confidence that bordered on arrogance and conceit, and Jen had known a lot of fighters who were as confident as Lawrence, but Jen got the impression that Lawrence was the rare example of someone who actually deserved that confidence. Jen couldn't get what Karen had said out of her head. She had claimed that her group represented an organization, the Soul Takers. Jen didn't know of any team with that name, and the name itself was unsettling. If Karen was serious, if she wasn't just making things up to sound intimidating, it meant that there was more to this than a simple challenge taken too far. "Tucker," Jen said, "I think there's more to these guys than meets the eye. We need a plan." "Oh, come on," Tucker replied, grinning. "He's just one guy. He doesn't stand a chance against both of us. In fact, I want you to hang back and let me take a swing at him myself." Jen opened her mouth to protest, but before she could, Tucker rushed to Lawrence. His attack was straightforward, and he didn't take the time to back it with soul. It was the same kind of move that Jen had seen him use many times to test the waters of a fight at the old park. Normally an attack like this wouldn't be a problem for someone as resilient as Tucker, but Jen just couldn't shake the feeling that this time was different. She sighed and charged forward a few steps behind him. Meanwhile, he threw a punch at Lawrence's face, which Lawrence blocked casually with his left hand. Tucker struck again, and Lawrence deflected this strike as well, then stepped in close, thrusting his left palm toward Tucker, striking Tucker square in the center of his chest with enough force to send him tumbling. Jen tried to use the exchange between Tucker and Lawrence to get inside Lawrence's guard, coming at him from the right side. She had assumed, based on his actions so far, that his left hand was his dominant hand, but as she drew close, Lawrence shifted his stance and raised his right hand to defend. He stepped around Jen's reaching fist, then elbowed her in the side of the head, knocking her to the side. Jen reached deep, calling upon the energy of her soul, lowering her own personal gravity. She fell lightly to the ground, then sprang back up instantly, sailing high into the air, hanging there longer than she should have. She shifted her weight, turning to face Lawrence again just in time to see him form his reptilian avatar arm again over his left arm, reach across the width of his torso, and grab her by the leg. With virtually no effort, he pulled her back down out of the air and slammed her into Tucker, who had just found his feet again. The two dueling hearts tumbled over each other. Lawrence was on them in an instant, his glowing golden arm swinging downward in a wide arc. Jen and Tucker rolled apart just before they could be hit. The impact of Lawrence's avatar fist against the ground was enough to crack the asphalt even through the rubberized padding that cushioned it. Tucker was on his feet first. He threw himself at Lawrence, lunging inside Lawrence's guard. He threw an uppercut at Lawrence's chest as Lawrence was still falling in the wake of his attack. The impact of Tucker's strike would have been huge anyway, but in that instant, Tucker forced some of his soul into his arm, increasing his offensive strength. Lawrence, at the last second, dissolved his avatar arm, crossing his arms over his chest, and then reformed the arm, letting it absorb most of the force of Tucker's blow. He was knocked back through the air, but he landed square on both feet, unharmed. Lawrence counterattacked. He raised his avatar arm up over his head and then lunged forward, swinging his arm at Tucker's head. Tucker darted to the side, then rushed at Lawrence, but Lawrence swung his avatar arm wide and swept Tucker effortlessly to the side before turning toward Jen, who had just finished tracing her gravity control sigil with her toes. Jen had used Tucker's insistent attack to buy herself time, but it was no use. She kicked the sigil at Lawrence, but he lifted himself up using his oversized arm, then threw himself out of the sigil's path. It flashed to life several yards from his position, lighting up the fighting stage with purple light. Lawrence shot Jen a wicked smile. She wrapped herself in purple light, lowering her personal gravity again just as Lawrence rushed her at his full speed. Jen could barely track his movements. The light from her sigil filling the backlot helped, and she was able to twist out of the way of Lawrence's right fist, then leap clear over his sweeping giant arm, but only just barely. She rolled in the air, landing behind him, but by the time she did, he'd turned to face her again. He thrust his claws at her, and it took all of her strength to deflect them to the side. As she had with Mike in the exhibition match, Jen left some of her energy in the glowing light of Lawrence's avatar, increasing its weight all at once, its hand dropping heavily to the ground. When it did, Jen hopped up onto it and ran up its length, managing to catch Lawrence by surprise. He dissolved his arm again, but just before he did, Jen sprang up and launched a quick front kick at his face. He ducked, and Jen's foot sailed over the top of his head, close enough to tickle his scalp, but he refused to let this shake him. He reached up and grabbed Jen's leg, twisted, and threw her hard. She wrapped herself in purple light once again, cushioning her fall, but she was still sent tumbling and left-winded. This time, though, it was Jen who had bought time for her partner. Tucker was on his feet again, and as soon as Lawrence threw Jen, Tucker was on him. He didn't have time to defend when Tucker jabbed him 3 times in the ribs and then delivered a full-strength right hook to his jaw. The Soul Taker was knocked off of his feet. He picked himself up quickly, but by the time he did, the makeshift arena was alight with fiery red and orange light. Tucker had forced his soul and his life energy to mix, awakening his aura. He shuffled forward, throwing one final attack at Lynes with force enough to topple buildings, but Lynes only looked amused. He shuffled back, and both his arms became wrapped in golden light that took the form of different arms, stubbier than the last, covered in thick, bony plates as well as scales. These new avatar arms had no long claws, but were durable enough to stop Tucker's striking dead. Tucker stepped back, surprised, his aura falling away. Jen, back on her feet, was just as taken aback. Lynes relished in their confusion. "You didn't think that my attack avatar was the only one I could make, did you?" he asked. "Even that amateur that your team fought in the exhibition match could make more than one avatar, and I'm far beyond his meager level of skill." He lowered his arms, and while the armored avatar over his right arm persisted, the one over his left arm disappeared. He raised his left arm, and with a flash of shimmering gold, the oversized, clawed arm reformed around it. "You can make them both at once?" Jen remarked. "You assume that I only have the two," Lynes replied cheekily. He lowered his left arm again, and both of his golden avatars disappeared. Golden light spread out like streamers from his back and formed huge wings, like bats' wings. They flapped once, twice, and again, lifting Lynes clear off of the ground. He didn't rise much further than a foot or two, but the display had the intended effect. Jen and Tucker were shocked. Their opponent could fly. "Do you really think you stand a chance against my dragonic avatars?" Lynes asked, chuckling. He flapped his glowing golden wings once, as hard as he could, and shot up higher. He dropped toward Jen and Tucker, his wings dissolving, one of the offensive avatars forming around each of his arms. He slashed with both. Jen and Tucker dove to either side, but they were too slow. They each struck a glancing blow. Jen was caught in the right side, and Tucker was caught in his left arm. Both were left with open wounds that, while not nearly as deep as they could have been, dripped with blood and left the two fighters in excruciating pain. From the sideline, both Joe and Sarah had to restrain themselves from leaping to the defense of their friends. Meanwhile, Jen and Tucker both, despite everything, struggled to their feet once again. They looked up at Lynes, just in time to see him strike the claws of his avatar arm against the ground, sparking waves of soul that traveled along the ground toward his opponents, shocking them and tossing them both like ragdolls into the air. Tucker landed on his injured arm and cried out. Jen, who had managed to land on her less injured side, wasn't much better off as Lynes approached them, his claws raised. "That's enough," Joe insisted, drawing Lawrence's attention to herself. "You've more than made your point." She was blown away. Never in her wildest dreams could she have conceived that Lynes might be strong enough to take down Jen and Tucker with so little effort. As far as she was concerned, the first round was over, but Jen had a different idea. "No, Joe," she said, pushing herself to her feet with a huge amount of effort. Just looking at her was painful, but she stood against Lynes anyway and declared, "I'm not finished yet." Lynes looked her over and said, "Interesting. I might have underestimated you after all. You have 0 chance against me, but you still keep fighting. I'd find it respectable if it weren't so pointless." "You literally just said that you underestimated me," Jen replied, circling Lynes slowly, "and here you are doing it again." Lynes chuckled and dissolved his arms. He lunged at Jen and threw a quick series of punches. Jen, acting mostly on instinct, managed to dodge or deflect them all, but doing so left her wincing in pain, having jostled her wound. She stepped to the side, turning her wounded side away from Lynes, and he stepped in closer, shuffled in place, and threw a kick at her torso, aiming for the very region that she was trying to protect. Jen knocked his foot away and retaliated, but the pain of her injury made her slow. She missed by a mile, and Lynes socked her square in the jaw. She almost crumpled, stumbling back into her side. She gasped and doubled over, clutching her side. Her face was shrouded in the shadow of her body, hiding her expression, but Joe thought that she could hear her cousin crying. Lynes stepped forward again and faced off with Jen directly. "You came so close," he told her. "You almost earned my respect. But in the end, you're just another pathetic wannabe. It's disgraceful that someone as weak as you could actually be one of the fighters that we're looking for. I didn't want to believe it, but fighting you myself, I can't deny it anymore." "What do you mean?" Joe demanded. She looked from Lynes to Karen. "I'll explain once the match is over," Karen promised. But long story short, the leader of our organization thought that you and your friends might be something special. It's why we were watching the 4 of you in the first place. Even after seeing you fight, we couldn't be sure if you were the ones that we were after or not, so we decided to test you ourselves." "And despite how pathetic they were," Lynes added, still glaring at Jen, "these 2 managed to pass." "Which means it's likely that the rest of you will as well," Karen concluded, never taking her eyes off the fighters in the makeshift arena. To Joe's surprise, Karen didn't seem to think that the fight was over. It took a moment for Joe to realize why. All of Jen's movements, as unplanned as they had seemed, had actually accomplished something. Lynes was turned completely away from Tucker, and Tucker was steadily sliding himself closer and closer. Jo realized what Jen was planning, and she likewise realized that her cousin wasn't crying. She was laughing. I have no idea what you're talking about, Jen told Lawrence with a chuckle, about us being special or whatever. But I don't care. You, Lawrence, are the most arrogant person I've ever met. You underestimated me and Tucker at every turn. You thought that you were in complete control of this fight, but you don't even realize that you've made a fatal mistake, that you forgot something important that's going to cost you this match. She looked up at him, smiling, and asked, Hey, Lawrence, remember that sigil that I made earlier? What exactly happened to that? Lawrence's smirk turned to a scowl as he realized that the sigil's purple light was nowhere to be seen. It had faded away minutes ago during his last exchange with Jen. He hadn't even considered that it might still be active somewhere, and he'd completely lost track of where she had initially put it. Jen, however, had not. Taking advantage of Lawrence's brief moment of confusion, she rushed him and tackled him, shoving him backwards. At the same time, Tucker sprang up and threw a spin kick at Lawrence's sternum, knocking him back further. He stumbled, and before he could rise again, he was bathed in purple light. The sigil flared back to life with Lawrence dead in its center, pulling him down before he could straighten up fully. Tucker moved to stand next to Jen, cradling his bloody arm. Despite everything, Jen had managed to get Lawrence inside her sigil. She'd won, with Tucker's help. She'd proven once again that intelligence trumps power. You can't do this, Lawrence said, his voice low, almost like a growl. Jen ignored him. Her body became wrapped in purple light, and she stepped casually into her own sigil, completely unaffected by the increased gravity within. She planned to finish Lawrence the same way she had James in the exhibition match, but unfortunately she never had the chance. You can't do this, Lawrence said again, this time loud, like a roar. His entire body was wrapped in golden light, and a huge avatar formed around him, lifting his actual body several feet off the ground. Jen shuffled back as suddenly Lawrence filled the entire sigil. He donned a full-body avatar shaped like a squat, wingless dragon with bulging, muscular legs and armored plates running from its flat-nosed face to the tip of its tail. The arms of this avatar were the same defensive arms from earlier in the fight. This was the body that went with them. Lawrence raised those arms and he slammed them into the ground with so much force that the ground beneath him shattered and exploded outward. The sigil beneath him shattered with it, and he rose to his full height of 15 feet. You lectured me about underestimating you, Lawrence said, while you were underestimating me. You never even considered that I was holding back this entire time. He stomped his dragon avatar forward, covering more distance than either Jen or Tucker would have expected on the merits of his size alone, and spun, slapping Jen with the back of his massive hand, sending her flying. She would have hit the back wall of the dojo, but Joe shadow stepped into her path and caught her. She was unconscious. Tucker looked on the monstrous form of his opponent with something between disbelief and horror. Jen had underestimated Lawrence in the end, but Tucker had underestimated him from the start. If he hadn't, they might have been able to work together to beat him before coming to this point. Now Jen was hurt, maybe badly hurt, and it was all his fault. Lawrence turned his avatar to face Tucker, as Tucker, acting on impulse, forced the energy of his soul to mix with his life energy again. He held those energies together for as long as he could stand, for much longer than the second or so that he normally did. Energy poured from him, melting the rubberized surface beneath his feet. It almost flew out of Tucker's control, but in the end he bore down on it, molding it, shaping it into an aura that reached above the streetlights. Tucker, his eyes shining with literal fire, turned that aura away from his back, launching himself toward Lawrence like a rocket, his aura flaring out behind him. He wound up and punched Lawrence in his avatar's chest with an energized fist. Fire exploded from the point of impact, filling Tucker's field of view, but he didn't need to see to know that he had failed. He could tell just from the feel of the impact that he hadn't managed to break through Lawrence's armor this time either. As the smoke and fire died down between them, Tucker collapsed at Lawrence's feet. Between his final outburst and all the blood that he'd lost, his energy was spent. Lawrence let his avatar dissolve and stepped toward Tucker with the same calm resolve that Jen had showed only moments before. The difference was, where Jen had assumed that she'd won, Lawrence actually had. He drew back his right foot and kicked Tucker square in the jaw with all of his strength. Tucker was knocked out cold, collapsing on the spot. Joe and Sarah were flabbergasted. They couldn't speak. They could barely think. They had heard of fighters as powerful as Lawrence before, but to them, people like him had always been stories. They were legends told by enthusiastic students in schoolyards who didn't yet understand what the typical limits of the human body actually were, even with soul running through it. Lawrence was an impossibility, and if he was this strong, it made sense to assume that Monty and Karen were at least as powerful. Jo looked once again at Karen. In fact, she could believe that Karen was far stronger than Lawrence had shown himself to be. With a deep breath, Jo forced her fear and her surprise out of mind. She stepped into the center of the back lot where Tucker lay within the debris of the ground that Lawrence had shattered with his attack, and she picked Tucker up and carried him back to the Dueling Heart's End, next to Sarah. Jo then returned to where Jen lay and carried her back as well. All the while, Lawrence watched her with amusement. "It's a shame," he said to her, "that my time in the arena's over. I imagine that fighting you would be much more interesting than fighting them." He shrugged, then walked over to stand next to his companions. Jo watched Karen, for some reason expecting her to step up next, but of course, as the leader of the group, she planned to fight last. Instead, Monty stepped into the makeshift arena, and Sarah stepped up to face him. "Wait," Jo told her sister, speaking quietly enough that she hoped their opponents wouldn't be able to hear her. "I'll go next. I might be able to use my shadow step to take this guy out fast and put an end to this." Sarah didn't answer at first. Then she turned to look at her sister, and Jo was taken aback to see fear flashing half-hidden in her sister's fierce eyes. "One of them beat Jen and Tucker without taking a single major hit," Sarah said simply. "Do you really think they'll leave if we win one fight? Do you think we'll be able to make them?" Jo was shocked. She hadn't even thought of that. Meanwhile, Sarah looked toward Monty and told her sister, "As much as I hate to admit it, you're the strongest out of the four of us. If these guys want something from us, you being at your best when they try to take it is our best shot. That means that you have to wait to fight for as long as possible. That means I have to fight next. There's no other choice." Jo couldn't argue. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to insist that Sarah was just as strong, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. She knew that Sarah was right. On any other day, she would have been secretly proud of that fact, but today she hated it, because it meant that she had to stand off to the side and watch her sister fight a battle that she wasn't capable of winning. "No," Jo thought, "that's ridiculous. This is my sister that we're talking about. There's no one she can't beat." Sarah might lose, that was a possibility, but Jo, in that moment, refused to count her sister out. She refused to assume that the outcome was already decided. She gathered up all of her stubborn resolve and said, "In that case, good luck. Go and get this guy." Jo wasn't sure in the low light, but she thought she saw Sarah smile. The air between Sarah and Monty became charged with energy, and the two fighters faced off. Without another word, the second fight began.